Good morning. My name is Rebecca Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the DC Preservation League. Thank you all for joining us today. We are live from the District Architecture Center today, and joining me today are my colleagues Kelly Knox, DCPL's Development Director, and also Melissa Laureano, our Programs Manager, Zachary Burt, who is our Outreach and Grants Manager, and Shay Corey, who is our AU Fellow. So they will be monitoring our Facebook comment section and also the Zoom chat. And so if you have any questions or comments along the way, please feel free to type them into the Q&A or into the chat, and we'll be happy to relay them to our speakers today. We're really excited about this program, as DCPL was founded as Don't Tear It Down in 1971 to save the old post office building on Pennsylvania Avenue. We were born during the infancy of the environmental movement, and this has always been a key issue for the Preservation League. We did a lot of things in our early days, such as bike tours to show people the city and the importance of historic buildings around the city and why their reuse was important to not only the city's history and culture, but also the environment. The mission of the DC Preservation League is to preserve, protect, and enhance the historic and built environment of DC. And the board has now focused 3 areas for our 50th anniversary. These are diverse stories, which are honoring DC's cultural heritage through telling diverse stories of underserved communities, historic preservation as a planning tool, and sustainability, combating the climate crisis through historic preservation. I'd like to thank our planning committee for their time that they've spent over the last 9 months putting together the first 3 programs that you'll hear about today. And I'd also like to thank our sponsors, who make these free programs possible to the public. And now I'd like to welcome Carl Elefante, who is our first speaker and our program chair. Carl is a principal emeritus with Quinn Architects, where he served as the design principal on architecture, historic preservation, and community revitalization projects. Known for coining the phrase, "the greenest building is the one that is already built," Carl writes and lectures internationally on historic preservation, sustainable design, climate change, and urban topics. And Carl is a senior fellow with Architecture 2030, working to advance building sector decarbonization globally, a founding member of the Climate Heritage Network, promoting the value of culture and heritage in curtailing climate change, and an adjunct professor at Catholic University of America and the University of Maryland. In 2018, Carl served as the 94th president of the American Institute of Architects. Carl is a fellow of the AIA and Association for APT, Association for Preservation Technology. Carl attended Pratt Institute's School of Architecture and received a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation in 1980. Carl?
Thank you, Rebecca. And good morning, everyone. Really delighted to be here this morning, and I think we're undertaking some really groundbreaking work here. I think it's important work. About a year ago, I got a call from Rebecca Miller from the DC Preservation League, just talking about that, here we are, we're about to have our 50th anniversary. My first reaction was to feel pretty old, because I actually kind of remember all this, this is an important moment, and it's an important moment for DCPL, and it's also an important moment for the preservation movement. In that conversation, which really kind of started with, we know you because you're that preservation guy that talks about sustainability. Where are we today? What should we be doing to talk about that for our 50th anniversary? And of course, the conversation went to climate change immediately. Where is this sustainable preservation movement today faced with the climate crisis? How does that really change the challenges for us as a preservation movement? And that's what this program series is about. The concept here is to really try to take a deep dive into this topic. Some of it will be the why and wherefore, but then also a lot of the sort of how-to in this. Where does it really matter? What should our priorities be? How can our concerns as preservationists really be applied to this challenge of climate change. We're able to do that in the context of one of the most progressive cities in the world who is confronting climate change, and that's the District of Columbia. The DC government has for, I would say at least a good 15 years now, really been seriously trying to confront the environmental challenges that it faces, from stormwater runoff issues and things like that, to climate justice issues and so on. I think that we're very fortunate to be doing this in the context of the District of Columbia. For example, DC is a C40 city. DC is a LEED certified platinum city. There's a lot of work that has been done here in the District of Columbia to really try to understand what the responsibilities of our community are in confronting climate change. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes, this host of other associated issues. So for us putting together this program series, it includes, I'll call it, the principles of what really needs to be done and how we can bring this Venn diagram of sustainability and climate action and preservation together and make that overlap richer and larger. So today's program really begins at the beginning of that, really considering what it means to have preservation attitudes, have preservation principles, and have preservation methodologies, and sort of bring them to this new topic. It also, though, begins with reminding ourselves that even though the deep dive is going to be talking about buildings and built heritage and what we need to do in the building sector, that we're actually part of a living, breathing community. Almost 1 million people live in this city, and about 4 million people live in the metropolitan area. Even though as an architect, it's hard for me to say this, there actually aren't just buildings in this community, there are actually people in this community too. And those people are confronted with a lot of issues, and all of those issues are now being filtered through the lens of what this means in terms of climate change. So that's kind of just a general overview of how this program series is kind of coming together. I want to go ahead and start with really diving into this notion of stewardship in the era of climate change. What does that mean? Our challenge is as stewardship concerned people, stewardship professionals with stewardship skills, et cetera. How does this really, play out for us? How does the challenge of climate change really change, alter, evolve what our skills are and what our concerns are, and ultimately what our contribution can be? So with that, I'm going to start to really dive in to open this session. I want to reiterate the thanks that Rebecca gave a minute ago. This has really been a huge group effort. Thanks first and foremost to Rebecca Miller and Kelly Knox from the DC the Preservation League that this has been a huge amount of herding cats and bringing a lot of different resources together. I'd also like to thank the people who really have contributed to kind of thinking it through and getting it organized, starting with Emily Eig and Julia Seipel, who were members of the planning committee who really took on a big load, and then some names that were mentioned by Rebecca, Melissa Cohen and Matt Dow, Philip Brought, Ben Williams, Sarah Vonesh, and Justin Loney, all of whom have given their time generously to really make this program possible. So this 50th anniversary, I couldn't have invented a call that would have resonated as much with me as the call that I got from Rebecca a year ago. Part of the reason that this resonated so strongly with me is that to some degree or another, this is kind of my life story. I was a kid in architecture school in New York City when a lot of this was sort of beginning. And the notion that DCPL was founded as a movement, as part of the preservation movement, that it was people carrying signs and walking in the street, that's very relatable to me. Completely understand that in the context of what it meant to be in architecture school in New York City back in that era. It really symbolizes the importance of preservation, not just as a preservation movement, but also as an environmental movement. So the notion that DCPL really had this in its DNA from day one is very exciting to me. This is something that DCPL was not alone by any means. I think probably one of the best images that was ever created in this whole creating this Venn diagram between sustainability and historic preservation is represented in this National Trust for Historic Preservation building as a gas can from the 1980 National Preservation Conference. It's an image that I see presented to this day, time and time again. It's powerful stuff. So, my roots in this being in New York in the 60s, again, this really resonated with me. Preservation, it started as a movement. Look at this image on the left. This is Philip Johnson and Aileen Saarinen, kind of members of the New York 400, the high society of New York City in the 1960s, out on the streets in front of Penn Station picketing to try to prevent that building from being destroyed. And of course, they didn't succeed, which I think probably had more to do with the launching of the preservation movement than if they had succeeded. The outcry, the outrage that came from the destruction of Penn Station really helped create the political will that led to the 1966 Historic Preservation Act, just a couple of years after the demolition occurred. This was reacting to what I would describe as criminal urban vandalism perpetrated in the name of progress, something that we in the preservation movement find just all too familiar. At the same time, this other movement was taking place, and that was the seeds of the environmental movement were also very much, boiling at that point. Many people point to Rachel Carson's 1961 book, Silent Spring, that really sort of popularized the notion, if you will, that environmental damage was being wrought by human activity and that the scale of it was literally global. We were really beginning to have an effect on nature itself. And the only way that we could be doing that was through human activity. So that sort of two-pronged aspect of her observation. One is that clearly this is about what humans were doing. And the second is that the scale of it was to a point where it was beginning to have measurable global consequences. And here we are all these years later, literally 60 years later, and we're still fighting the battle of its human-caused reasons for climate change. And oh, look, the effects are global. Can we please get over this and get on with the business at hand? And again, Rachel Carson was noting the criminal vandalism to the ecosphere perpetrated in the name of progress. And then I just want to mention one other aspect of this, which is that none of this is happening in a vacuum. All of this was really happening in the context of our society and our culture and our cities. And that, the version of progress that was being promoted by Robert Moses and his ilk was really having effects on the community. Were they really improving the communities that they were intended to improve? That was the intention of it. This was supposed to be progress. And in the end, I think that you can see in city after city the inequitable impact that this definition of progress had on those cities. And Washington is a case study. of a city that is struggling today, all these many years later, with the impact of this definition of progress, with the inequities that have been exacerbated by a flawed vision of progress. So the DCPL program series will really focus on the built environment. But as I said, we want to begin this program by mentioning the built environment and laying the foundation for that discussion, but really reminding ourselves that this is about the impacts on a community of people. As stewards of buildings, we're stewards of the physical condition of those buildings, but we're also stewards of the heritage of those buildings. So I really want to start by talking about our role as the preservationists of built heritage. And really, what does that mean? How does that evolve in the era of climate change? And I want to say a couple of things about built heritage just to set the context. First is for us as professionals to recognize that built heritage is not alone. It's actually part of a rich fabric, a deep weave of many heritage elements. Built heritage, these by the way are the ICOMOS six heritage categories. Built heritage is somewhat unique among this category, these six categories of heritage. And we as stewards of the built heritage have specific skill sets that we need and specific challenges that we face. I'll start by just talking about how absolutely fundamental built heritage is to our understanding of humanity, human culture, civilization itself. What would we know about ancient Egypt without the pyramids? What would we know about any of our cultures without built heritage? It's incredibly durable. It lasts for thousands and thousands of years. Some of the very, very oldest things that we understand about the legacy of those who came before us is communicated to us through built heritage. The second thing that I would mention about it is that unique among the heritage categories, built heritage is literally living heritage. As we building preservationists know, the most important thing that we can do to preserve a building is to use it, is to occupy it. Very, very little of built heritage is not occupied, is not used. I mean, okay, the pyramids are not being used anymore, even though that maybe they're still housing the souls of the people that were buried there. But most heritage is living buildings. It's buildings that are still lived in and used, maybe not for their original purpose. But as a historic preservation architect, I can tell you that there's nothing more important than using buildings to preserve them. It motivates everything about their care, and also it creates the income stream that allows us to take care of them. It's the first rule of historic preservation. Use it, occupy it. There's another side to this, though, and that is that it means that built heritage is also part of the problem. Heritage buildings produce greenhouse gas emissions. Heritage buildings are literally part of the climate change problem. So we need to solve that. Even if we say, we're not interested in climate change, we're not going to get outside of our lane, we're just going to stick in this lane. Even if we just stay in this lane, we have to do something about climate change as stewards of those heritage properties, if nothing else. The other thing that really forces us to recognize that we have to get involved in this, that the built heritage itself is begging us to get involved, is that built heritage is being destroyed by climate change every week. These images should seem awfully familiar to you. Wildfires today, it's something that's in the news every week. How many tremendously historic storms per year do we need to have before we start paying attention to the consequences of them? The two images that are on the bottom of this slide are from within 40 miles of where I stand today. One is what's called daytime or sunny day flooding in Annapolis, Maryland. So sunny day flooding in Annapolis is happening at a rate 10 times more than it did 30 years ago. So what is the impact of the global warming that we've already experienced? Well, things like sea level rise are really beginning to affect places like Annapolis. Annapolis, Miami, and Norfolk are all experiencing sunny day flooding at historic rates. On the bottom right is a picture of Main Street in Ellicott City, Maryland. This 1,000-year storm has happened twice in the last 5 years. So I think we have to change our definitions. If a 1,000-year storm happens twice in 5 years, maybe it's not a 1,000-year storm. And this historic flooding is happening again. It's every week you're finding things like this in the newspaper. So again, even if we just want to stay in our lane and we don't really want to get outside and more broadly approach the issues of climate change, the built heritage itself is begging us to please get involved. We have to do something about the climate crisis. So as stewards of the built environment, as stewards of built heritage, what does it really mean to change what we're doing, to evolve what we're doing, to address the climate disaster, to prevent a climate disaster? And I want to start this by another little bit of a trip down memory lane. The situation that we're faced with makes me think of the situation that John F. Kennedy was faced with as he took office as president in 1961. His inaugural speech is referred to quite often. I think that you probably are familiar with the "ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." That was actually the conclusion of this part of his speech, where he talked about the hour of maximum danger that his generation had been selected by destiny to address. And of course, the destiny that he was talking about, the hour of maximum danger that he was talking about, was nuclear weapons and the potential for nuclear holocaust. And he was not whistling Dixie. It was fewer than 2 years later that the Cuban Missile Crisis took place, and the world came closer to nuclear exchange than any time before or since. And what Kennedy challenged us to do was to transform the arms race into the space race, to really take the challenges that his generation was destined to face and really turn that into the engine of progress for his generation. Will we be as smart as Kennedy? Will we address the climate change crisis as open-mindedly and optimistically as he responded to the hour of maximum danger that he was faced with? So climate change is our hour of maximum danger. And in a lot of ways, it's far more insidious than nuclear weapons. It's in everything we do. You have to sort of dig to find it in many ways. You can't just count nuclear warheads to figure out how much in danger you are. It will take far, far more global cooperation to resolve the climate crisis than it takes to this day to really control nuclear holocaust. And we've learned a lot about this notion of the hour of maximum danger in the last 2 years facing the pandemic. And this is a cautionary tale. How did we do? We certainly didn't get an A on this. We certainly didn't prevent the pandemic crisis from happening. And to this day, we're still struggling to get our arms around it. We have to do much better than this if we're going to address the climate crisis. So here we are facing a very, very large-scale hour of maximum danger. And, what do we need to do to really rise to the challenge? to a great extent, this program series is about the preservation community, the preservation movement, doing just that. Let's get busy. Let's get to work. Let's get working on resolving this climate crisis through our heritage conservation perspective. So let's get right into the heart of this and really recognize that we're talking somewhat of a new language here. We need to be comfortable talking about decarbonizing buildings and the building sector and cities themselves. So what does it mean to decarbonize the building sector? And what does it mean to decarbonize the building sector here in Washington, D.C.? And of course, it starts with a framework that was established at the Paris Agreement on Climate Change in 2015. Someday, I hope that Christiana Figueres will get her due, one of the all-time most amazing negotiators ever, to bring 200 nations together to agree on climate action and recognizing that we all had different roles to play. It was really an incredible achievement. The essence of it, our operating instructions that came out of Paris, were really two things. One is that we need to cap global warming. We have to stop it. And the agreement in Paris was to cap it at 2.0 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And then the second was to give us a deadline, to say we have to get this done quickly. And again, the deadline was established there, 2050. It's been almost 6 years since Paris took place. And we already understand that that framework is insufficient, that the Paris Agreement framework will not prevent climate disaster. And that in fact, we need to be far more aggressive and we need to act far more quickly. So the 2.0 degrees is really 1.5. And there's a whole other discussion, and we'll get into this in future programs, of what is the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees? What does it mean in terms of the frequency and severity of wildfires, the frequency and severity of catastrophic storms, the frequency and severity of droughts and flooding? The difference is monumental. And that realization is bringing people to Glasgow for what's called COP26, the 5-year check-in on Paris, which is actually happening 6 years later because of the pandemic. So we have new numbers to work with that represent new urgency to this challenge. As we begin to look at the decarbonization of the building stock itself, again, kind of speaking this language of climate change, we need to understand that we're talking about a new yardstick, and the yardstick is called greenhouse gas emissions. We need to be getting our arms around greenhouse gas emissions and wringing them out of everything we do. So I'm going to just take a minute here and present a little bit of UN climate change data on greenhouse gas emissions. This is how the UN sorts greenhouse gas emissions by category of use, with industry and transportation, miscellaneous other things that includes, for example, agriculture. And then there are actually categories of building sector greenhouse gas emissions. Those building sector categories are a little complicated, but again, this is language that I think that we can get to understand. So globally, 39% of greenhouse gas emissions today are caused in the building sector by the building sector. That number is about consistent with what it is in the United States of America. In Washington, D.C., central cities like Washington, D.C., that number is way higher. In Washington, D.C., the building sector is responsible for nearly 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's no solving climate change without figuring out what to do about the building sector. It runs right to our door. The categories that are reflected here, and again, we'll get into them more in the future, are direct emissions, in other words, the burning of fossil fuels on site from gas-fired water heaters and boilers and gas stoves even. Indirect emissions, operational emissions, which are coming from basically consuming dirty electricity that is generated from fossil fuels off-site. And then last but not least, embodied emissions, which is the one that gets everybody's head hurting to try to understand what this means. But it's the emissions that are produced by the construction industry and by construction activities themselves. So add them up globally, and the largest sector in contributing to greenhouse gas emissions today is the building sector. But as our program today is devoted to demonstrating, climate change is not happening in a vacuum. That's true both in theory and in the realities of communities like Washington, D.C. It interlocks with many other circumstances. And in fact, the climate crisis is really part of a much larger and multifaceted series of intransigent social, economic, and environmental issues that we're facing. The climate crisis is also happening at the threshold of the urban era, when for the first time in human history, more than 50% of people live in cities. And by century's end, the UN estimates that nearly 9 in 10 people will live in cities. So whatever the solution is going to be has to be solved with the cities that we create. These interconnected crises have been understood since the beginning of understanding sustainability as a concept. It was part and parcel to Gro Harlem Brundtland's commission, the Brundtland Commission that is known for having sort of defined sustainable development for the world in 1987. And those interlocking crises are part and parcel to work that's been done at the UN in concert with the Paris Agreement, the adoption of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals just a few months before Paris, and then the adoption of the new urban agenda less than a year after Paris at the Habitat 3 conference in Quito, Ecuador. Just want to add one more point to this, which is this something that only UN bureaucrats are worried about? And the answer to that is no. The much maligned UN people are not the only people that are concerned about this. And my favorite example to point to is work that was done when Mike Mullen was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 2007 to 2011. Mike Mullen asked his Pentagon to do a study of really what are the strategic concerns that he, as the protector of the nation's security, should be concerned with. And he found that the number one threat to UN security was climate change. So it's not just about UN bureaucrats, it's people being really serious about what the future of humanity is that are addressing this. So here we are with our DC programs series about really understanding our role as stewards of built heritage and stewards of the built environment in addressing climate change. And I just want to again refer to the history that we have of really being involved in the environmental movement. We've done the work to get here. As Rebecca said, I'm known for coining this phrase, the greenest building is one that's already built. Well, the National Trust did a study a few years ago, about a decade ago, that basically took case studies and really showed that that was really true, that the environmental consequences of a building renovation project are measurably fewer than building new buildings. Today, the Climate Heritage Network, to just cite one example, is deeply involved in planning for COP26, which will take place in Glasgow beginning in November, and really representing the work of the heritage community, the arts and culture and heritage community in taking on this climate challenge. And I just want to mention that this is also largely the brainchild of one of DC own, Andrew Potts, formerly a historic preservation attorney here in Washington, who's really devoted the last several years of his life to preparing for this moment to go to COP26. And I'll just end by saying our challenge here at DC Preservation League, and as being citizens of Washington, D.C., and for that matter, citizens of the world, is to really transition the historic preservation movement to this moment of climate change. Our movement is galvanized, was galvanized by the destruction of Penn Station, and it's time for us to be galvanized over the importance of the climate crisis. Criminal urban vandalism in the name of progress is not the mode that we need to be in here. We need to be in the mode of really responding to climate change and being effective stewards and being effective partners in this. And I'll just take us back to Kennedy's inaugural address, where he concluded his remarks about the hour of maximum danger by saying, "I welcome this responsibility." And I think that this is our opportunity to not just address a crisis, but to really get to a new understanding of what it means to be stewards of the built environment, to create healthy and equitable and sustainable communities for the future. And that's what this program series is here to begin. With that, I'm going to conclude my remarks and introduce the next session. We will shift gears now and really begin this discussion about what it means to be climate stewards, to be built heritage stewards in a living, breathing city. And we're extremely fortunate this morning to have two really terrific speakers that will just kind of help us really understand what it means to be part of a community in an era where there are many intransigent social, economic, and environmental issues that we really need to relate to. I'm going to introduce Mindy Thompson Fullilove, who is joining us here virtually. Mindy is a social psychiatrist and professor of urban policy and health at the New School in New York City. She went to Bryn Mawr and got her MS and Doctor of Medicine degrees from Columbia University. She is a board-certified psychiatrist, which I can attest to personally by the number of times that she helped me and a number of other AIA board members, talked us off the ledge, if you will. Her work as a professor in urban policy and health at the New School is just absolutely cutting edge, just very, very important work. She's published more than 100 scientific papers. I've read quite a number of them, and 8 books, including her highly regarded and just really indispensable Root Shock, Urban Alchemy, and Main Street, which I recommend very strongly. So we should be ready to pull Mindy up onto the screen, and I will turn it over to Mindy.
I'm a social psychiatrist, as Carl said in the introduction, which means that I look at the social systems and how they structure our mental health. And he mentioned the report about insecurity in the United States, and it really had 2 parts. One, but part of it is that we as a society are disconnected. We are disconnected from the politics of the society, from democracy, and we are disconnected from each other. And this has risen to crisis levels. And it means that we're not able to have sane debates about policy. We have insane debates about policy. And I say that as a psychiatrist. The kind of debate that has gone on around wearing masks to prevent the spread of a pandemic has been symptomatic of deep, profound structural disconnections. So the issue is we can't just think about climate change as a set of technical solutions. We have to think about how does a fractured society begin to put itself back together. And here I want to focus on main streets. And if we could go to the second slide, you can see that the main streets. So this is a classic main street. I did a study of main streets where I went to main streets in 178 cities in 14 countries over a period of 11 years. This is where my study started on Palisades Avenue in Englewood, New Jersey. And you can see the sweep of the street. And the sweep of the street and then the amalgam of civic and commercial and public uses that line its sides is the heart of this thing. And this thing that was created by history, it's part of our legacy, our architectural legacy, our built environment legacy. Next slide. Part of my Main Street study was visiting Main Streets. And I'll talk a little bit about my method, but one of the things about Main Streets is that you just always see something interesting. This first picture is Phoenix, Arizona, where it's hot and there weren't any people out, which is astounding on a main street. But there was this thing. I have no idea what it was or why it was there, but it was very Main Street. Next. As is this, which I saw on Carson Street in Pittsburgh. I hate everything. Very Main Street. And you just never know. Next. In Jersey City, I found this Aqua's Perfect Braids with all these amazing pieces of art out on the street. Jersey City at this point was in the process of gentrification, but it was in that period where the artists have arrived, but not the richer people. So everything was kind of funky and cute in an adorable way. Next. One thing about walking Main Streets, and as I was just doing this study, whenever I was in a city, which could be the summer, the spring, the fall, the winter, is there was always weather, some kind of weather. And it's outdoors. And that really helps you appreciate the extent to which we're in public space when we're on Main Streets. And it also helped me appreciate the labor that it takes to make a Main Street. This guy who's out shoveling, very important on that day when the snow was quite slippery, was helping everybody. He was helping to make this space. Next. And so, sort of like, so what's going on as we're making this space? If you look at this hardware store, which has a Benjamin Moore sign, I'm very fond of Benjamin Moore signs, and they're in many cities all around the United States. You see the inflatable Santa Claus, you see all the, bright and festive things telling us it's Christmas time. But also these buildings are not new buildings. They're buildings that have been built, back in the day. Main streets really come into fashion. A lot of early Main Streets, like Carson Street in Pittsburgh, goes back to the 1880s. Newer ones, go back to the 1920s. So these are buildings that have a concept, they have history, but in a way, it's the concept that's most interesting to me. How do you make a street wall like this? Architects and designers and builders thought of this and realized the power of this design that they had stumbled upon. Next. And you can see at many times of the day, and as the lights come on, the form of this, what I came to think of as the box of Main Street. So the idea that there are these walls on the side of the street, and that this is very pleasurable to human beings. Next. But part of what attracts us, I think, is that there's always an interplay between the moment and the durée, the longue durée. This has been there for a long time. But look, it's Valentine's Day, and Mickey and Minnie are in the window. Next. I have a colleague from medical school, Dr. Martha Stittleman, who's in this photo, standing by the flag, and she lives in Vermont. And so every summer I go to visit her, and standing Main Streets is the country store. Main Streets are basically the corner store taking itself apart, kind of the way a cell divides, sort of mitosis. So in the next slide, you'll see one of the features of this store, which is there's a deli. There are some things you need, so that's good to have. Next slide. There's a post office and a bulletin board for local notices. Next. And upstairs, there's a thrift shop. In case you happen to need a bread machine, there's a bread machine. Apparently, in every thrift shop in Vermont, you can buy a bread machine. All of these things differentiate over time so that the general store, which has it all, becomes the post office and the thrift shop and the deli, and then the coffee shop, which is where people continue to meet. It's this differentiation over time that gives Main Street the character that it has in the United States today. Next. one of the fortunate things that happened in this study was that a colleague of mine, Hirofumi Minami, who's an environmental psychologist in Japan, came over for a sabbatical. And I was able to work with him and with another colleague of ours, David Chapin, who was then at CUNY, to think about how was I to study these main streets. I was going to visit them, but what was I doing? And he had this idea that what we're doing, which he called the psychoanalysis of the city, was a stroll and scroll. And so these are some of the scrolls that you find in my book. The idea being you take a stroll, you take some photos, and then you reflect on what you've seen. So you bring in other books, you bring in newspaper articles, you bring in random thoughts, and you create these scrolls. Next, I was also really fortunate to have the support of my colleague at the New School, William Marsh, who's an architect and an incredible thinker, who posted all these like pictures that I thought these pictures are the heart of my study, and he wrote all over them and put in post-its just to help me think what was it I had seen. So one of the things. So if we go to the next slide, this is kind of a diagram I made of like the basic, part of what I'm seeing is structure. This structure that has evolved over time that creates a sense of security, of welcome, of both continuity and change. This is composed of the box of the Main Street, what we call Main Street, this amalgam of a set of civic, commercial, public buildings and public space. This is a box. This has a beginning, a middle, and an end. In Englewood, it's 6 blocks long. But this is built around the line of the street, the public space, and it is nested in the urban space. And so the integrity of the box, the vitality of the line, and the completeness of the circle really create that all of these work together. And how architects and designers figured this out, I don't know. But anyway, this is what they figured out. And this is a gift from history. And what is it a gift of? It's a gift of power. This has power to pull us together, to help us cross paths. In the next slide, all those photos on the wall. One day I was looking at the set and I asked them, what are you trying to tell me? And one of the things they're trying to tell me, they said back to me, is this flow, this movement, that main streets are both about, are simultaneously about rest, encounter, and movement, as the great phenomenologists would say. Next. But there is another lesson from Main Streets that I learned through work I did with my colleague, social psychiatrist Jacob Eisenberg, which is that Main Streets exist simultaneously as an individual Main Streets and as part of a collective of Main Streets. And the Main Streets sit in this tangle of streets. And this is fundamentally important, next, for understanding, in a way, the brokenness of our society. Jacob and I did a study of every Main Street in Essex County, New Jersey, where I live and work. And we rated them on what we called hospitality. How intact was this built form? Did it create this space of welcome? And then we looked at the extent to which what we thought that Main Streets that were intact and had this powerful form would be the ones that invited sociability. And indeed, that was what we found. And what's important in the map in the center is that the Main Streets vary. Some are these black ovals, and those are the high hospitality Main Streets. Some are this medium gray, which are medium hospitality, and some are light gray, which are not hospitable. Now, some of the ones that are not hospitable are in the suburbs, places that were built without Main Streets. And some are in the disinvested old industrial city of Newark, New Jersey. So what's important here is that the lack of equality across the board, the lack of a set of connected and well-funded and strong Main Streets is taking a pillar out of the ways in which you create a society that can function together. And in the book, we talk about the ways in which we saw this in Essex County, and also I speculate about the recovery from Tropical Storm Irene in Vermont as the general stores have fallen apart. Next. So Hirofumi Minami's method, this stroll and scroll, gives us a powerful tool for really looking at any city and beginning to treasure what we have and think about what are the next steps. So this is a group of my colleagues at the University of Orange, the Free People's University, and we're at the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Essex County, which is a historic church. We're in the middle of trying to get historic status for our church. Anyway, we were doing a stroll and scroll in Orange, New Jersey. We had strolled, taken some photos, and we were laying them out on this scroll and thinking about what we had seen. Next. And a group of our colleagues used this same method, this stroll and scroll method, to put on a music festival. And what they did was visit all the main streets in Orange and find restaurants that were interested in participating. And then what they were able to do was have the musicians play basically in the public space by the restaurants. So here they are at a restaurant. The young woman is the owner. The man is a carpenter who's building those tables. And one of the things that happened was that a restaurant nearby was having a problem with a window and wasn't going to be able to participate. The team, having met this carpenter, was able to call him up and say, could you help them with their window? Which he did, and then they could participate in the festival. So in strolling and scrolling and talking and meeting, we learn fundamentally important things about what's going on, where is help needed, and can this one help that one? And this is always the way in which you make society stronger. We are, just want to share with you some photos of the festival. It's just the next slide. So you can see various places in the city, and at the top, in the photo on the left, is the historic old newspaper building. Our main street is one of the most historic in New Jersey, though, of course, want to tear it down and redevelop it. So the festival took place all over the city and was really important in sort of recognizing our history, recognizing what we have, and then using it to build community. So the last slide. So there's an incredible African-American artist who made these remarkable drawings. And in this drawing, which is kind of Main Street, right? This is very much the feeling of what I think happens on Main Street. He said of this photo, it was just an exciting time. So Main Streets are exciting, they're important, they're a gift of history, and they have this particular power to bring us together. And if there's anything we need in America right now, it's power to bring us together. Thank you.
So Mindy, thanks so much. I really appreciate your doing that. Can Mindy hear me? Can I actually ask Mindy a question? And okay, so the answer to that is no. Okay, well, we will at the end of the session today kind of gather together all the questions from the chat and so on. Obviously, unfortunately, we're not going to have Mindy respond to questions at this point, but we'll try to address any issues or any questions that anybody raises. So I'm just going to go ahead and transition to the next session then. We have with us today Gregory D. Squires, who is a professor of sociology and public policy and public administration at George Washington University. Really thrilled to have Greg with us here this morning. Greg is a member of the Fair Housing Task Force of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights, and the Social Science Advisory Board of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council in Washington, D.C. I'd also just note that Greg is also on the board of the Duke Ellington School of the Arts here in Washington, D.C., so that you can see that Greg applies his theories to the benefit of the community that we're all part of here. He's also served as a consultant on civil rights to many organizations across the country, and to me, one of the most interesting things about Greg's resume is he's also a member of the Federal Reserve Board's Consumer Advisory Council. Talk about being where the action is these days. His recent books include Meltdown, The Financial Crisis, Consumer Protection, and the Road Forward with Larry Kirsch, and The Fight for Fair Housing, Causes, Consequences, and Future Implications of the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act. So we're delighted to have Greg with us here this morning. So Gregory Squires, come on up. As Greg makes his way to the podium, I'll just mention that following Greg, we're going to switch gears a little bit and really start to dive into the building stock aspect of this and really lay the groundwork for understanding the circumstances here in DC. Just press the arrow on the right. Yep. Take my mask off. It's all yours.
Well, I want to thank you for the invitation. Thank all of you for coming. These crutches are a real pain, but I was talking to a friend of mine who just got off his crutches. He said he was never treated so kindly by his friends and family members and total strangers. And he was thinking of actually keeping them for a while, even after his leg was healed. But I don't think I'm ready to go that far. I'd also like to second the endorsement for Mindy's book, Root Shock. I'm actually using it in my class this next week, and my students in the past have always liked it. Now, Mindy talked about some forces that have the potential for bringing us together. I guess I'm the glass half empty guy, and I'm going to be talking about some of the things that are tearing us apart. Now, when we talk about historic preservation or climate change or any issue that's related to the sustainability or resilience of neighborhoods or entire cities, I want to argue that these are fundamentally political issues. That is, these are questions of power and equity that are at the core. I often begin presentations by quoting Gerhard Lenski, a sociologist who wrote a book in 1966 called Power and Privilege, where he defined the study of inequality as the study of, quote, who gets what and why, unquote. And I think that's a good question for us to keep in mind as we think about the challenges of preservation, climate change, and sustainability. So when we think about preservation and sustainability, we're not just talking about the conservation of natural resources, the cleaning up of polluted waterways, maintaining clean air, investing in public transportation, weatherizing buildings, and other physical and biological challenges. Certainly these are some of the core challenges we face. But equity is a central issue. And I think when we think about the goals we're here to talk about, we have to keep the politics and the power and the conflict issues at center stage. This is a graph that some of you have probably seen that I think gets at part of what I'm trying to talk about. This shows that even when we establish the rules or the formality of equality, this doesn't necessarily get us where we want to go. I mean, there's a lot of debate over whether we should be about equal opportunity or equal results. Well, this shows that sometimes even when the goal is equal results, depending how we define it, it doesn't get us where we want to go. To get to a situation where we have true equity and true fairness, sometimes we have to understand that there are different approaches we have to make towards different populations to get to the point where people do have true equity and true equality and equal opportunity. Along the same veins, here's a couple quotes that I've always liked. We see Eleanor Roosevelt saying, "When it's better for everyone, it's better for everyone." And Jim Hightower was a former state elected official in Texas and a political pundit, and who's absolutely outrageously funny. If you get a chance to read any of his books or his articles, offered the same kind of observation when he said, "Everyone does better when everyone does better." So what we're talking about then is the intersection of physical and political factors. And the two key equity issues that I want to spend a few minutes on today are the persistence of racial segregation and the surging concentration of poverty and wealth in the United States. Now, there's been a lot of discussion of racial segregation in very recent days. The Census Bureau has come out with some reports documenting the persistence of segregation. And what we've seen reports that black-white segregation has declined somewhat. It sort of peaked in the 1970s, and black-white segregation in the United States has declined over the last 30 or 40 years. But this is somewhat misleading because where we see the declines, it's primarily in relatively small cities with relatively small black populations. These are cities where if you evenly spread out the black population throughout the metropolitan area, very few whites are going to encounter these folks. In a city like Detroit or Washington, D.C., or any of the major cities where the black population continues to be concentrated, levels of segregation by any measure are still very high, reaching what's referred to as hypersegregation. Because you take a city where the black population is 30 or 40 or 50% and you spread it out evenly, people can't avoid them as easily. A couple of, and of course, when we talk about integration, segregation, and so forth in the United States, it's not just a black-white phenomenon. And one of the persistent findings is that Hispanic and Asian segregation has persisted at lower levels than black-white segregation, but there's been no reduction in the segregation or isolation of these groups over time. One of the statistics that I find particularly striking comes from John Logan, Brown University. In the 1940s, the typical black family lived in a neighborhood that was 40% white. Today, the typical black family lives in a neighborhood that is approximately 40% white. So in other words, there's been no increase, no change in the exposure of African American families to white neighborhoods. This has been a persistent form of isolation that we've made no progress on. And while it's the case that segregation has a number of factors, to some extent income may play a role, to some extent preferences to live among people that are like us, particularly in the white population, plays a role. But the predominant factor that accounts for segregation over time is a variety of discriminatory practices by real estate agents, mortgage lenders, insurance companies, appraisers, and others who are involved in the housing production and distribution systems. This was revealed once again just 2 years ago, just less than 2 years ago, by Newsday newspaper in Long Island, which did a study of discrimination in Long Island. What they did, they sent out pairs of testers, white and non-white couples, to the same agents to see if they would be treated differently or the same. And they were assigned the same characteristics. In fact, the non-white couple was usually assigned slightly more favorable characteristics, slightly higher income, longer job history, and so forth. And what they found was in 49% of the tests between blacks and whites, there was evidence of serious discrimination. We're not talking about the white couple being offered a cup of coffee and the black couple not being offered a cup of coffee. There were significant differences in the types of homes they were shown, the neighborhoods they were shown. Steering was dramatic across the board. For Hispanics, it was 39%. For Asians, it was 19%. So not all groups were treated the same, but there was significant discrimination that was found. Again, this is in Long Island. This is New York. This is not Mississippi or Alabama, or pick any other southern state that is your favorite to pick on. And my apologies to all of those who are from the South. Now, one of the favorable things is that as a result of the Long Island study, at least 3 real estate agents who were included have had their license temporarily suspended by the state of New York, and that process is playing out now. Let me turn for a moment to the issue of economic inequality and the concentration of income and wealth. Just a few numbers. That white households today typically have about 10 times the wealth of the typical black household and about 8 times the wealth of the typical Hispanic household. Now, there have been lots of different studies, and the numbers vary for African Americans for anywhere from 6 or 7 times the wealth of the typical black family to over 20 times. But there's a consistent pattern, and it's clear that wealth inequality is dramatically different by race. Just a couple other quick numbers. The top 10% of households controlled 61% of all wealth in 1989 and 70% in 2018, according to the Federal Reserve. So we see an increase in the share of the population controlled by those at the top. And where it really gets to be dramatic is not just in the top 10%, but if you look at the top 1%, or even better yet, the top 1/10 of 1%, you see dramatic growth in the disparity between the distribution of those at the top and those in the middle and those at the bottom. Just a couple of examples. There are 3 men in the United States have more wealth than the bottom half of the population. And that's Jeff Bezos with 114 billion, Bill Gates with 106 billion, and Warren Buffett with 81 billion. Now, I don't know if any of you folks are in this neighborhood along with these guys, but it shows the growing separation, if you will. And I think perhaps even more revealing is that today in the United States, the typical CEO of a firm makes over 300 times what the average worker makes in a firm. Back in the mid to late 1960s, this ratio was 20 to 1. I don't think anybody is suggesting that CEOs have increased their value relative to the typical worker in their firm by this much. And the United States is a real outlier in this. All other industrialized countries, the ratio is around 50 or 60 to 1. We're at 300 to 1. And there are spatial dimensions to these numbers that I'm giving. What we have here is a table that shows the number of concentrated poverty census tracts. These are census tracts where over 40% of the population is poor. And we see that in the US between 1970 and 2011, the number of these tracts tripled. The number of people living in these neighborhoods also almost tripled. And we see Washington, D.C. is not much different. Perhaps what's even more revealing is that the number of middle income tracts has declined. And more important, I think we see that the share of poor people, low income people living in poor neighborhoods has increased dramatically over these years. It's one thing to be poor and living in a middle income neighborhood with good schools, safe streets, healthy foods, and so forth. It's a different experience to be poor in a neighborhood where the schools are failing, where the streets aren't safe, and you can't get healthy foods and so forth. One more slide along these dimensions. This, again, shows how we're growing apart. The percentage of low-income tracts during these years grew from 12 to 18%, and the upper-income tracts doubled from 3 to 6%. So, again, we're growing apart. We're growing apart socially, and we're growing apart spatially. More importantly, these aren't just numbers. These aren't just statistical patterns. This reflects and has consequences for the real life experiences that people have. So we know, for example, that in general, people who live in lower income, predominantly non-white neighborhoods, compared to people who live in middle or upper income neighborhoods that are predominantly white, those folks who are at the lower end of this spectrum are more likely to live in neighborhoods with poor schools, fewer job opportunities, higher crime rates, fewer healthy food options, a concentration of predatory financial services like payday lenders, check cashers, and pawn shops, few conventional or mainstream banks, more hazardous waste facilities, less aggressive remediation efforts to clean up those facilities, and almost any quantitative or qualitative measure of life. We see that racial segregation and the concentration of poverty have dramatic impacts on the objective life experiences of people in those neighborhoods. I think the COVID pandemic drives home these disparities that have long been with us. We know, for example, that African Americans and Hispanics are 3 times as likely as whites to contract the virus and are twice as likely to die from it. And there's no great secret as to why this is happening. And we hear these reports that the virus doesn't care about your race or ethnicity. It affects everybody. It does affect everybody, but it doesn't affect everybody the same. And it's not because of some kind of natural phenomenon, but it's because of the social structure and political and economic structures that we've created. So, for example, we know that people of color who are more dramatically affected are people who were more likely to have lost their jobs during the pandemic, which means they're more likely to have lost what health insurance they had. These are folks that are concentrated in the most vulnerable jobs: hospital workers, grocery store clerks, restaurant workers, bus drivers. These are folks that are more likely to rely on public transportation, less likely to have access to their own automobile, more likely to experience food insecurity, more likely to face eviction or foreclosure, leading to more crowded housing conditions and more vulnerability to the pandemic. These are folks that are more likely to have the underlying conditions that make people vulnerable to the pandemic. There are higher rates of asthma, diabetes, high blood pressure, hypertension. And one interesting study I saw in the New York Times about a year ago, people of color tend to use parks that are smaller and more concentrated. So when they go out for their recreation on the weekends or whenever, people of color are more likely or less likely to be able to social distance themselves when they're enjoying the parks that we provide. John Logan, again, has argued, quote, "The housing market and discrimination sort people into different neighborhoods, which in turn shape residents' lives and deaths. Bluntly put, some neighborhoods are likely to kill you." Let me illustrate this with just a couple maps of Washington, D.C. What we see here is life expectancy in a couple different neighborhoods. And if you look at the difference between Friendship Heights and a couple neighborhoods in Ward 6 and 7, we see life expectancy ranging from 60 years to over 90 years. This is over a 30-year difference in how long people live in two neighborhoods that are, about 5 or 6 miles apart from each other. And here's a map. You can't see all that clearly, but what it shows, the darker areas are the neighborhoods with the highest poverty rate. The large dots are the reflect longer life expectancy, the smaller dots, shorter life expectancy. So we see a clear pattern connecting poverty levels with life expectancy. And you know, I could show you maps that show almost any indicator, income, wealth disparities, which will yield the same kind of health patterns. So, again, as I said at the start, when we talk about preservation and sustainability and resilience, these are fundamentally political and power issues. Every dollar that a police department spends to settle a case of an unlawful shooting of a young person is a dollar that city doesn't have to weatherize buildings or to clean the local water supply or to clean up the beaches. If a family wonders where their next meal is coming from, or if they fear that they're going to be evicted by the end of the week, they're probably not going to be engaged in many activities that are aimed at nurturing the sustainability of metropolitan areas. Communities without access to credit can't survive. If people can't get mortgage loans, they can't buy a home, they can't improve their homes. If they can't get small business loans, they can't start a small business, they can't build or expand their existing small business. And a study of insurance discrimination back in 1968, a federal agency concluded that communities without insurance are communities without hope. And I think that hasn't changed today. So let me conclude by reading a few lines from a poem called Gentrification, written by Dion Harrison and Kenny Carroll. And I'm just going to read you a few of the stanzas. I think I've got the full poem on the PowerPoint slides, but I'm not going to walk through the whole thing. Let me just read you a few lines. And I do this because I think this probably says what I've been trying to say in a few lines much better than what I've spent all this time trying to say. But let me just read you this. It says, "I have seen a neighborhood eat itself for dinner, look at its vibrant culture and call it a meal when the food ran out. They opened a Starbucks and called it community transformation, repeated the process until property prices popped. Suddenly, every face on the block looked like it belonged in an Even Stevens episode, when years ago they were afraid to walk it. So here we are, the long-awaited sequel to White Flight, White Return. I remember when they started calling my home theirs, and then had the audacity to name me a visitor in a city that I was born in. And there is such power in a name, the way they changed New York Avenue into Noma, the way they changed displacement into renovation, and Black into impoverished, and impoverished into forgotten. I'm from Brooklyn, Northeast, not Brooklyn, New York. I'm from $1.75 is all you ever needed on your smart trip. I'm from late nights, gallery play starting around under the streetlights. I'm from calling Malcolm X Park, even though the city renamed it Meridian Park. And people who aren't from my city still ask me, what is the problem? What is this? Well, this is landlords raising prices till the poor fall through. This is investors promising to bring back residents after construction, then going back on their word. This is city council members selling out on morals. This is college students benefiting from a community but giving nothing back. So when the suburban settlers begin to tell you what the city means, of how they've translated your urban into something that can Plymouth Rock on their tongues, I hope I tell them, this is my home, born and raised in. I lived on these blocks, found first purpose, drew first blood, left my jeans in the cracks of the sidewalk. This soil knows my story. I learned its face with my fingertips. I've got its pulse stuck in my palms. Here we are, the monuments with the cherry blossom hearts, cut us down and watch the city lose its soul. The struggle, the way we overcame, the way we overcome, the future, the past, the way we move and refuse to be moved. And really, I just don't want to lose my home. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. When we conceived of what we were going to do today, it all sounded really great in theory, but I had no idea what a powerful introduction to this topic we would really have. Mindy really reminding us that the urban form is something that we all create together, and it really is reflective of our how cohesive we are as a society. And it's a tool by which we're able to, work together better or not. And then, I'm a big believer in what do the numbers tell us. And I think Greg shared with us some really powerful numbers about the challenges that we face as we try to address climate change. We can't address it as though it's the only thing in the world that matters. If we address climate change and we don't have the impacts of social equity and economic equity and environmental equity, in mind, we'll exacerbate conditions. We won't improve them. So it's very important for us to have this context in mind, and we kind of got the spirit and the numbers part of it in the last two presentations. So again, I want to really thank Mindy Thompson, Fullilove, and Gregory Squires for sharing those thoughts with us. We're going to take a break now, and when we come back, we're going to switch gears quite a bit and really start the inquiry into the building sector challenge that we're faced with today. And really kind of lay some of the essential groundwork for what will be the decarbonization challenge that we'll be facing here in the District of Columbia. So we'll be back in about 10 minutes. So we'll be back at 10:40 for the next presentation. Well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to go on to a session on city form and community heritage. So after that powerful introduction from Mindy and Greg, we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of really the challenges that we face in being stewards of the building stock here in Washington, D.C. Think of this as really laying the foundation of what is our challenge. What's the facts? Let's start with the facts. Let's start with the realities of what we're dealing with. And we're going to do that by having the perspective of a historian and DC's most formidable mapper. And so those people are Sarah Vonesh, who is a historic preservation specialist working with EHT Traceries, a historic preservation consulting firm here in Washington, D.C. And I know that every preservation architect in the city knows exactly who Sarah and EHT Traceries are. She provides guidance to clients on the interpretation and application of relevant planning policies to the treatment of historic properties, districts, and landscapes. And Sarah is also the company lead on environmental sustainability, and resiliency. So she's exactly the person that for us to turn to understand this particular topic. Sarah received her MS in historic preservation from Columbia. I don't know if you ran into Mindy while you were there. And also historic preservation and community planning from the College of Charleston. And then Brian Kraft, who is our just mind-blowing mapper, focuses on technology-appropriate treatment of historic resources to visualize, analyze, and understand the past. Brian has a BS in computer science and post-baccalaureate certificate in GIS. Gosh, maybe we could have used you to try to get us online earlier today, Brian, both from Penn State. So he's been researching and writing and speaking about DC history since 1997. His research also has really dived in the Columbia Heights neighborhood with the historic trail and the second edition of Washington at Home, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Brian created the DC Historical Building Permits Database, which we're going to be drawing from heavily here, and the initial draft of the History Quest DC, which includes that what's called the Prologue DC Mapping Segregation Project, which is a kind of a 3D mapping of DC's heritage resources. His new project is mapping early Washington, focusing on the founding of the city of Washington and its existence and growth since 1800, which you'll see we draw from mightily in our presentation today. So just the facts, ma'am. What is the challenge that we face in being the stewards of Washington's building stock? Let's get to know the building stock. So Brian and Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Carl. And good afternoon, everyone. So the purpose of our, is it on?
Check.
Okay. The purpose of our program this afternoon is to provide you with an overview of the history of the city to provide a good foundation as we move forward with the future programs coming up as part of this. All right, sorry, I can't see the slides. So this is an overview of our presentation today. Brian will begin with an overview of the boundaries of the city, an intro to Georgetown and the L'Enfant Plan. And then we'll go back and forth through the development periods, starting in the early 19th century through the 21st century, looking at maps showing the development patterns and historic buildings and architecture that were prevalent during those periods. And then we'll end with a brief introduction to the historic landmarks and historic districts of DC.
We're going to be showing a lot of maps, so I want you to be oriented. And so this is the iconic outline of Washington D.C. as it is today. But it started out like this. The U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, gave Congress sole legislative authority over a place not to exceed 10 miles square. That's a square 10 miles on each side, that may be ceded by the states to become the federal territory in which would be the capital city. And that is where George Washington placed it in 1791. Let's see, we're already on the one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
And to cut ahead, it's sort of a tangent, but it's not in chronological order, but it's a relevant fact that due to various circumstances, including lack of development on the Virginia side of the federal territory, Virginia retroceded its land in 1847, leaving us with, again, the outline that we recognize today, the bounds of Washington, D.C. Next up. All right, zooming out, back when it was the 10 miles square, also in 1791, President Washington hired Peter L'Enfant, a naturalized Frenchman, to place and plan the federal city within the federal territory, the capital city, rather. And that is the outline of it right there, perched right on the rivers. We call it, you see in the upper left, it was called back then Washington City. Today we either refer to it as the L'Enfant City or the Old City. When you hear the term Old City, that's it outlined right there. That's the bounds of the L'Enfant plan for Washington, D.C. Next. And there it is. We've zoomed into it. And you see the rivers on the bottom, the Potomac, and what they called the Eastern Branch, what we call the Anacostia to the southeast, lower right. What is that slide, Sarah? Oh, okay. Oh, that's the. It's a funny color from this angle. This old map shows the approximate lay of the land at that time. There were large tracts, hundreds of acres. It was very sparsely populated. We're talking about probably just a few hundred people. It was open land, some forest, some agriculture, some orchards. Next. The town of Georgetown was already there. Let's zoom into the next slide. Georgetown, obviously on the banks of the Potomac, and right across Rock Creek from the Old City, was there already. In the mid-1700s, it was founded by Scottish merchants. Its story is very similar to that of Alexandria, Virginia, what we call Old Town today. Both port cities in their respective colonies, founded in the mid-1700s, and mostly exporting tobacco back to the Old World.
Well, by the time the federal government moved into the District of Columbia in 1800, Georgetown was already established and had a mix of building types, including, vernacular workers' dwellings, wood frame, finer commercial rows with residences above, larger estates, as well as churches, and of course, Georgetown University. And because it was existing, it really became the social and political center of Washington, not the political, but the social center of Washington in the early days.
All right, let's get back to the Old City. This is the plan that Peter L'Enfant drew for the city, and it is very much what we recognize today with east-west streets and north-south streets irregularly placed to create different sized blocks and crisscrossed by the diagonal streets that we recognize as the state streets. Next. All right, and that is there is the L'Enfant plan as it was put on the ground. These are the original squares and streets that largely are intact today. And we have one more. Okay, there it is. When the federal government moved here in 1800 from Philadelphia, this was the lay of the land in terms of development. You can see it's mostly clustered downtown along Pennsylvania Avenue between the Capitol and the White House, on the east side of the White House. You see some in between the White House and Georgetown, which kind of makes sense. This is higher ground away from the river. You see some development around the Capitol, what they called and what we still call, of course, Capitol Hill, and down by the Navy Yard. The Navy Yard was already in existence when the government moved here in 1800. So that was a manufacturing area. So there was always a working class population down there. And then one outlier, that's what they called Greenleaf Point. That's on the southwest waterfront. I think that was largely speculative and ended up being kind of a weird mix of mansions and very poor working class down there. Next. Here's a map of all the listings, all the residential listings in the 1822 city directory. Now, regardless of what I'm mapping, what the source is, these are all ways to get at the extent of development and the placement of development at these different times. So this is 1822. And you see the exact same patterns. It's just filling out a little bit more. And with the exception of Greenleaf's Point, which again, there was speculation down there that didn't really, Washington didn't become the commercial center that lots of people thought it would. So that's one of the neighborhoods that did not really grow. But other than that, you have mostly the downtown area, again, just east of the White House. And jumping ahead about a generation, this is the 1858 city directory mapped. And you see the city really starting to fill out. It took a lot longer than people at the beginning were hoping that it might. But here it's starting to make good on its promise as a city. And now you do see the southwest waterfront area really filling out as well.
So the first development phases in Washington really focused on the public buildings, namely Capitol Hill, the Capitol Building, and the White House. Both were partially completed in 1800 when the government moved to Washington, but then both were subsequently destroyed in 1814 after the British stormed through Washington and burned all the public buildings. So these early public buildings were constructed of stone, and they were designed in classical styles, and that was meant to symbolize the permanence of the federal government. So public buildings slowed down for a couple of years as funds were dedicated to the reconstruction of the Capitol and the White House, and then started again in the 1820s and 30s as new neoclassical and Greek Revival federal buildings such as the old Patent Office and the General Post Office were completed, these being in just above Pennsylvania Avenue and Penn Quarter area of downtown. At the same time, buildings like the Smithsonian Institution Castle was being constructed on the mall, kind of separated from all the other development in the city, but closer to the development of Southwest. And it was started in 1847, just a year before the Washington Monument was started nearby. So in addition to the early federal buildings, you have early residences built around the White House and the Capitol. These federal and Georgian style single-family homes or detached dwellings were constructed of brick. All three shown here had enslaved dwellings included. And we also see early examples of the row house form that Washington quickly adapted to its own in the later centuries. Here you have Wheat Row in Southwest at Greenleaf Point, and the 7 buildings, both representative of the federal and Georgian style architecture of the period. And then eventually you also get more modest worker housing throughout the old city for the new residents that come to the district as the government presence grows. And you see these in Shaw, downtown, Mount Vernon Square, as well as Foggy Bottom and Capitol Hill. And these houses were generally 2 stories with steeply pitched roofs and large chimneys. And as building material technologies advanced and changes in building forms, you start getting flatter roofs and larger building forms that become more affordable.
Here's the Boschke map made by a guy named Albert Boschke. Just before the Civil War, he compiled information for this map in the 1850s. And it's really an astonishing document of the city and the whole territory, the whole district, just prior to the Civil War. And here you can see the development patterns we've been talking about. You see Georgetown in the upper left. And beyond the bounds of the old city, which I should mention, the northern boundary of the old city was called Boundary Street. We know it as Florida Avenue. And beyond there, you can see large tracts still, open land, some forest, some field, some orchard, some agriculture. Here's a map of a real estate assessment from 1873. So this is a snapshot of what was on the ground in 1873. And you can see the development really starting to approach the boundary of Washington City, Florida Avenue. This map shows red brick buildings in light red and wood frame buildings in brown. And you can see the pattern of red brick downtown, mostly. And you can see some red brick to the north. That's early post-Civil War row house development up around Logan Circle. But you see a real strong predominance of wood frame buildings, even as late as 1873. All right. Let's zoom out now to the whole district as it was and as it is. And I've kept the bounds of the old city in there just for reference. And here is development. This is development from 1873, the previous map, through the end of the century. And this only shows what's still there now. So if I mapped everything that was built at that time, it would look a little bit different, particularly downtown. But this is what exists today from that time period. So you can see that by US standards, we have a lot of old buildings in Washington, DC. Again, this shows, it's kind of hard to see when you zoom out, but in light red, you can see red brick buildings. That's what you see mostly in the old city and in Georgetown. And you see speckles of wood frame buildings in dark brown. You can see in Uniontown, that's Anacostia, just across the river to the southeast of downtown. And Brookland is starting to be built. You see some freckles of dark brown up there. You can see Columbia Heights and Mount Pleasant. And you can make out the beginnings of Cleveland Park, just to the west of there, just left of Rock Creek Park, which was not in existence, but I have it on this map for reference.
So the population increases more than threefolds in the years after the Civil War, fueling this expansion outward. And the new streetcar lines, first drawn by horses and later electrified, really accommodate that growth and that expansion beyond the original boundaries of the city and where the development had previously taken place. New federal buildings, as you can see, look a lot different than those built during the previous era. We see a lot of different Victorian era styles and use of a lot of new technologies and materials that come about. And also massive buildings utilizing advancements in cast iron and steel construction. The old post office, completed in 1899, was the largest and first steel frame structure in DC. And it was also the first to include electrical wiring as part of the design. And commercial buildings in the downtown, have a similar style from the period, Richardsonian Romanesque, Queen Anne, and other styles. At this time, the previous primarily residential area in the downtown area moves out north and east, and then beyond the old city into Washington County, leaving the downtown area ripe for new development. And it's during this time that downtown really gets concentrated with new banks, department stores, and other commercial office buildings. And this is also the time when the row house really becomes the predominant architectural style and building form that you see throughout the city. Starting with more modest two-story buildings, and then growing later in the century to more grand and ornate buildings. The row house form was the most efficient and the fastest and the most cost-effective way to add new housing for the residents that are coming into the district at this time. The design of these row houses is greatly influenced in 1877 by the new district building code requirements that push wood frame buildings to the suburbs outside the old city boundaries and the dense areas of the city, as well as Georgetown. And they're also influenced by the Projection Act of 1871, so a couple of years before the building code. And the Projection Act allowed developers to project their building footprint into the public right-of-way. And this gave them greater freedom to add architectural embellishments such as the towers, the bay windows, and other features that we see every day in our neighborhoods. At this time, we also see a lot of picturesque villas, cottages, and Victorian single-family houses, detached dwellings, constructed in the suburbs outside the old city boundaries. L'Enfant, Anacostia, LaDroit Park are two of the early suburbs that are right outside the city boundaries, accessed by the early streetcars. And later in the 1880s and 90s, electrified streetcars and commuter trains provide easy access to areas further out in the county, like Tacoma Park, where you see the Katie Lee home, and areas around Tenleytown. With all the new residents and the newly freed African Americans, we also get a lot of alley dwellings during this period. Originally, they started as frame dwellings that were in poor condition, without plumbing or running water. And slowly during this period, they're replaced with modest two-story brick dwellings. And you can see these alleys we have Naylor Court and Blagden Alley, of course, a historic district. And you also see these in Foggy Bottom and in Capitol Hill. And they really housed the destitute citizens, or the citizens that couldn't find housing elsewhere, especially during a time when restrictive covenants come in and exclude classes of people from some of the new suburban development outside the city.
All right, moving on to the 20th century. Here's the first 3 decades. And this map, like the last, shows what was built at that time and is still extant. And some of the same patterns of brick buildings within the Old City, Georgetown, and immediately north of the White House area. This is row house time. This is the time of the streetcar development, and that allows neighborhoods to really thrive further from the city center. So you can see largely wood frame neighborhoods in Brooklands to the northeast, and Chevy Chase, and far northwest up where Connecticut Avenue leaves the city, and in southeast you see continued development, particularly pretty far south in the Congress Heights neighborhood.
So after years of neglect and encroachment during the Victorian city era, the Macmillan Plan, the Macmillan Commission, in 1901 published a plan for the city that directed planning throughout the 20th century. And it really called for the return of the L'Enfant Plan and a more respectful approach to the plan, as well as other goals such as creating public parks and facilities throughout the district and installing new sanitation, as you see at McMillan Reservoir. And this plan was really based in the City Beautiful movement, obviously coming from the 1893 Chicago Columbian Exposition, trying to bring order and beauty into the city centers. Okay, so one of the first efforts after the McMillan Plan is published is removing the existing 1870s era railroad tracks from the middle of the mall. So as part of this, Union Station, the Grand Beaux-Arts Station, just north of the Capitol, is constructed, consolidating the railroad tracks and restoring the open mall space. The Lincoln Memorial was another major federal project during this period. It was the first to be reviewed by the U.S. Commission of Fine Arts. That was also established during this period, and was placed, strategically placed, in a location that was called for in the plan for new monuments along the mall. And of course, the Treasury Annex, another building, following the guidelines and recommendations of the plan for new federally, classically inspired federal buildings. You also see this with design and construction of new museums along the mall and new both public and private institutions, such as the Carnegie Library and Constitution Hall. The plan and the City Beautiful movement also inspired designs for new commercial buildings in the downtown. You can see the Evening Star Building and the Chesapeake and Potomac Telephone Company, and the use of white brick and white stone clearly derived from the styles and recommendations from the City Beautiful movement. We also see Woodworth and Lothrop, which developed over a couple decades in the first part of the 20th century. And that really became the standard for what would become future department stores that provided everything you needed in the city. The city continues to grow as the federal government grows, and new workers are constantly moving to the city. New suburban residential neighborhoods pop up. Most were established earlier at the end of the 19th century, but really took off during the 20th century with easier access. You see these in Sheridan, Kalorama, and these are all in Northwest, but with a variety of styles, including Georgian Revival, Tudor Revival, Spanish and Mediterranean Revival. But you also see a lot of wood frame dwellings like those seen here, bungalows, craftsman style, 4-square houses in neighborhoods throughout the city, all over the place. These where wood frame detached houses were built. And the increasing popularity of pre-manufactured, pre-designed houses like the Sears Roebuck house becomes popular and fuels this growth. And the house you see on Chevy Chase Parkway is one of those Sears Roebuck houses. Another style you see everywhere in the city during this period, the Washington row house. It's slightly wider than other row house forms, always including a full width porch, usually 2 rooms deep to enhance natural lighting and ventilation on the interior of the house. They featured colonial revival and craftsman style details, and really were found all over the place and easy to construct for developers, obviously. Huge swaths. You also get a lot of apartment houses to house these new workers. Apartment houses began to be developed in the city in the last century, at the end of the last century, but really took off in the first part of the 20th century. Nearly 700 were constructed between 1900, between World War I and 1930, really showing the popularity of this building type. And you have modest apartment houses as well as more luxury apartment houses like the Wyoming and the Whitelaw Hotel, which was the first purpose-built by and for apartment house for African Americans.
Moving on to the time period from 1930 to 1944, this is marked by, of course, the Great Depression and World War II. And these two great events, of course, there was a lot of sacrifice by all Americans. But Washington, as the federal government town, is kind of booming at that time. So there is still a lot of development in Washington, D.C. And you can see from this map, it's almost all in brick. There's a lot of apartment houses, small apartment houses being built. And you see most of the development is pushed pretty far out, approaching the perimeter of the city, western, eastern, and southern avenues.
And these perimeter areas are become very accessible with the automobile and increased automobile ownership. By the 1930s, the streets, as you can see in this image, were crowded with streetcars, cars, buses, pedestrians. And as a result, we have new building forms and types to serve the automobiles. We have service stations, car dealerships, bus stations, and new commercial strip malls that are catered to the automobile, a new type of building form not seen in previous decades. The New Deal program funding really transformed Washington. A lot of funding came into the city. A lot of new employees for the federal government come into DC, really getting us through the Great Depression. The New Deal era programs funded things like bridges, infrastructure, sewers, parks and recreation centers like Langston Golf Course. Of course, the Jefferson Memorial was a major building developed as part of New Deal programs. And the completion of Meridian Hill Park, even though it had started much earlier in 1912, it wasn't until additional funding became available and it was completed in 1936. Lots of new federal office buildings constructed during this period as the government grows. The National Archives is completed in the Federal Triangle, originally envisioned in the Macmillan Plan. We also have the strip classical style emerge with the Federal Reserve Building and the U.S. Department of Interior building. Both of these buildings, if you see in the lower right-hand corner, feature lots of legs with open courtyards, or wings, I'm sorry, with open courtyards, allowing a lot of natural light and ventilation into these offices. And that we'll see soon changes with further advancements. We also see housing programs and funding as part of the New Deal. Oftentimes, the new public housing and workforce housing took the form of garden apartments made up of 3 to 4 story buildings in groups set within a landscape setting. These were all segregated during this period. And we continue to see the evolution of the row house to fit the styles and preferences of the residents of the time period. You can see the Tudor Revival style row houses coming in, as well as the alternating gable and flat parapet forms employed in Anacostia and Kingman Park. And these are also seen all over the city. And we also have a prevalence of colonial revival single-family homes during this period, as the FHA really promoted the use of the colonial revival and inspired by the restoration of colonial Williamsburg.
And now moving on to the time period after World War II and the second half of the 20th century, I can no longer map frame and brick, so I've changed the colors here. This is just all the development together. And in downtown DC and areas closer into it, to the old city, it's mostly redevelopment, older buildings being taken down and replaced with newer. But you see, most of the development outside of that area is in areas where there was open land, particularly at the northern point of the city and along Eastern Avenue, and in what are now wards 7 and 8 across the Anacostia from downtown. That's open land being built upon.
So we come to the peak of DC's population in 1950, and shortly thereafter, it really starts to decline as newly built suburbs are easily accessible by the automobile. New highway funding comes in, and we get developments like the Beltway and the Southwest Freeway through Southwest. And we also have a change in the population as white residents move away and the Black population increases. So the city identified a number of areas as slums or undesirable locations, including Southwest, which they cleared in the 1950s despite lots of protest from the predominantly African-American community that lived in Southwest. The clearing of the neighborhood made way for the Southwest Freeway, new federal office buildings, as well as new modern apartment and townhouse developments, part of the Southwest Renewal Plan. Okay, well, here are some of the modernist apartment buildings developed during the period. You have, sorry, I went out of order. Tiber Island in Southwest. You have the Watergate Complex in Foggy Bottom. And you also have a new town development that was a federally subsidized program out in Fort Lincoln. And you can see the senior citizens village from that period. The federal building program was really significant during this period. It's when the federal government began to accept modernism as an acceptable style to represent the federal government. In 1962, President Kennedy issues, he engages a committee and they issue a report finding that modernist and contemporary architectural styles are the preferred building method. In 1950, so a little bit before that, you have the General Accountability Office just around the corner from here. That's the first large city block federal style building or federal building without courtyards, without light and air. And it's really, it becomes the primary form of building, the large block office building, but is possible with the development of air conditioning systems during World War II, as well as fluorescent lighting to light all the interior offices. So then you also see the modernist international style, brutalist, formalism, all the other modernist styles from the period shown in these buildings, these examples. And this extends as well to new museums and the Kennedy Center and the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Library, international style library by Mies van der Rohe. And then later in the decade, it's really new office building that sustains the downtown and really comes into the downtown. And this is following the construction of the metro, first completed in 1976. So these new commercial office buildings in downtown can now be reached by the workers out in the suburbs. You also have the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation that's promoting the redevelopment of areas of Pennsylvania Avenue with new buildings like the Market Square in the 1990s. The Inelstat headquarters as well, and up in Northwest, which is one of the first buildings in the city to really utilize green building technologies to reduce its carbon footprint and energy reliance. And finally, here are some example of some single-family modernist houses that you see throughout the city during this period in tracts where there was empty land at the time.
All right, let's move on to this century. And we can move straight to the next map, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. And Sarah has labeled all these for us. There's whole new neighborhoods being built, even if they are redevelopment. A neighborhood like the Wharf is a place where we didn't have intense populations living there, but now that's exactly what it is. It's a mixed-use area right on the southwest waterfront. The Yards, or the Capitol Riverfront, is a huge development that's maybe only halfway built just yet. The H Street corridor in Northeast is booming with some redevelopment. The Noma neighborhood is it's a neighborhood that didn't exist, I think, about 20 years ago. Columbia Heights has some delayed urban renewal up there. Fort Lincoln in far northeast has been more or less completed by now. And in the far eastern point of the city, Capitol Gateway neighborhood is being built. And there's lots of neighborhoods that are reuses of old campuses, like St. Elizabeth's in southeast. I'm going to talk about some of the buildings that are being built this century, and as we speak. This is a very common form, the townhouses, large tracts of development or redevelopment in a lot of cases, and typically 3-story, pretty good sized, 3+ story row houses or townhouses being built in areas like Parkside, over near Kenilworth Park, and in far southeast, neighborhoods like Wheeler Creek. You see some semi-detached buildings down at the bottom. Those are from very early in the 2000s. Now you see much more townhouses. And there, of course, has been some detached houses as well. Ashford Court shows at the bottom. That's in the far southern part of the city. I think that was built with some public money, and you don't see this building form anymore with public money, to my knowledge, detached buildings such as that. But you do see it in private developments, like out in Foxhall Circle, that building you see on the left there. And of course, lots of apartments are being built. Here's 3 pretty good examples. At the bottom, you see in the Yards in southeast, that's First Street looking south. And this is a 2019 view, so probably all these buildings are completed by now, but there's lots of buildings underway and on the boards still down in southeast by the ballpark. And on the left side, you see a building from the east end of the U Street neighborhood. That's 8th and Florida. Not very high rise up there, but still new buildings, new ground being found for redevelopment. And one big area for redevelopment is the Eckington neighborhood you see in the upper right.
So before we wrap up with an introduction to the DC inventory, just thought we'd pause on the screen. Brian talked about all the historic campuses that are seeing a lot of redevelopment. A lot of these are existing historic districts and previous campuses and historic sites that no longer serve their original purpose. So places like Walter Reed, the Yards at the Navy Yard, Union Station, St. Elizabeth's, the Wharf, which has the remnant of the Washington Fish Market, and McMillan Reservoir are our next phase of development that's happening right now. So then for the DC inventory, we have the District Preservation Act, which is passed in 1978, and we also have the the old Georgetown Act passed in 1950, really providing protection to the historic districts and landmarks in the city, all over the city. We have 73 current historic districts. They are divided into neighborhoods, a lot of which we've looked at and talked about today. Government institutional, we've also seen a number of the federal buildings located within government historic districts, and then parks and parkways. And you can see they're dispersed throughout the city, but there's a concentration in the northwest quadrant. Landmarks too, throughout the city, representing all the periods that we looked at today and different themes. And again, a lot of concentration around the White House and in the Old City. So I hope that provides a good overview, and you got a good look at a lot of our historic landmarks and districts. And I think we're happy to answer any questions if you have any. The question is, what is the takeaway of what needs to be done going forward? And I think that's something that the next couple of programs are really going to get into, how we tackle that. But I think we've shown there's a lot of historic sites that have made it and have been adapted and contribute to the sustainability of our city, as well as a lot of historic campuses that are being redeveloped while retaining the historic character and preserving the historic sites that are important to us, while also meeting the needs of Washington today. Now, that's what I would say.
Well, my work is to document the provenance of the buildings of the district, and I'm happy to have that be used as the basis for such decision making. I can't personally weigh in on that. Because well, it goes to the, I have thoughts about the development of this history. My job is to look backward, and I don't so much look forward in that respect, frankly. So smarter people are going to do that than I.
We have a couple of questions online. The first one is, what are the principal climate challenges faced in DC?
Oh, the question was, what are the principal climate challenges facing DC?
So I'm going to rejoin here, and just to start by saying that, we sort of collected these things over the whole presentation. So this closing session here will really be about every one of the presentations, not just the last one. So the principal challenges that we face, here in DC with climate, we can look at it both in terms of what we have to work with versus what are the threats. We're relatively sheltered from many of the threats that other communities are really struggling with. So wildfires, not high on our list. Hurricanes, well, yeah, but we're not really all that coastal. We're not a New Orleans or a Manhattan. So we're not quite as subject to those kind of storm surges. We showed both with Annapolis and with Ellicott City, actually the storm intensity issue and the flooding issues were absolutely subject to that. I can tell you that in last June, I watched 4 rivers flow around my house. On a normal day, there's no rivers around my house. It just we had an Ellicott City-like rainstorm in Tacoma Park then. It just, I've never seen anything like it. I thought my house was going to float away. So in terms of those threats, we are really in not immediate danger of a whole lot of the list of the kind of typical changes to the climate and what that means in terms of direct impact on our city. Flooding's the one that we've seen time and time again. That's very real. The way that climate change does threaten us, though, is so where are we getting our food from? Where are we getting our power from? Where are we getting our materials to build our city from? Where are we getting our people from? So the sort of second tier of everything that are the resources that our city depends on, all of those things are affected by climate change. And we'll talk about some of this in future programs. I'll just point to food as the one that really is global. The people in the climate change world who are most concerned about what will the first truly horrible impact be from climate change are the food security people. The idea that climate conditions could result in the starvation of millions, even hundreds of millions of people is not fantasy at all. It's the hour of maximum danger that Kennedy talked about. It's our hour of maximum danger. I'll just give you a couple of little examples of that. So it was just 2 years ago, we had such severe flooding in the Midwest here, right when the corn season and other growing season was just beginning, that our crops were down by more than 20%. Our crop land was down by more than 20%, just because of 1 year's storms, exceptional rain. California and its water crisis. I forget exactly the number. I want to say 70% of the food that is non-grain food, which is grown in the Midwest, but non-grain food of fruits and vegetables and things like that. I think 70% comes from California's Central Valley. If California's Central Valley dries up, where are we going to get that food from? So those sort of secondary impacts on us being able to function as a city are very real issues with climate change. And I'm just going to add one more. If the Greenland ice sheet collapses completely, Washington, D.C. will be underwater. That's the reality of the ice situation. So that's super catastrophic. That's not on anybody's list of what's likely to happen in the 21st century, but we don't know. We don't know what the actual security of that ice sheet is. We don't really know the factors. And we know that today it is melting at more than 10 times the rate that it was melting at in 1980. We all get to see ice melt at the North Pole to a point where ships can now travel across the North Pole. They haven't been able to do that ever before now. There's also questions about whether the ice cap in the Antarctic is threatened, and there's a couple of indications that maybe we're in real trouble there. So those are sort of the direct impacts. But I just want to take this opportunity now to really close the session by really trying to ask, what did we learn today that's really focusing on the central question for today? And that is, is protecting and celebrating our community and our built heritage, is that really something that has any importance for climate action in the District of Columbia? And if it does, why? Is this program series even worth having? And so kind of what did we learn today? And so Mindy Thompson Fullilove is probably the best person that I can think of to just ask us to be social creatures and to look around at the world and ask ourselves, how is this environment that we created, how is it accommodating the things that we need as people? And her perspective as a psychiatrist, she started right out. She didn't pull any punches at all. Our public policy discourse today is insane. It is self-destructive. Our current policy, where are we going with the pandemic? We literally have suicidal policy today being bandied about seriously as like, this is important policy, this is what we ought to be doing. It's literally killing tens of thousands of our citizens. So Mindy is an awful positive person that just, exudes, just kind of love and reassurance in every word that she says. But her message is chilling about where we are. And what she's trying to get us to do is to look at our main streets, look at the environment around us, and ask ourselves, is it cohesive? Is it supportive? Is the environment we created, and particularly the environment that has been seriously impacted by the last 70 years of this modern era Robert Moses style development, are we creating communities that reflect who we are and that are really helping us be the people that we would like to be and fulfill our lives? And she also gives us something to work with. Go do a stroll and scroll. Go look at your environment. Go understand, how is that environment impacting your life? Where is it helping you? Where is it creating barriers for you? That's what we need to do, not just decarbonize. We need to, in decarbonizing, be sensitive to really, creating a better communities for ourselves and all those that we are working with. Greg, in his presentation, also started out with some, pretty bucket of cold water. Wake up, come on, let's recognize what's going on. An awful lot of the decisions that are being made are basically power decisions. It's power struggle. We can't be afraid of political discourse and understanding that this is about not just equality, but equity. This is about having solutions that are solutions that work for everyone. And I loved his quotes from Eleanor Roosevelt and the other. This is about everybody. And in the world of climate change, that's not just some hippie theory. Okay, in the world of climate change, we need to decarbonize transportation. We need to decarbonize utilities, electric generation. We need to decarbonize industry. We need to decarbonize our cities and our houses and our buildings. What that means is that we need to basically retool everything to decarbonize it. Well, if we're going to retool everything, we have to do it everywhere, or else we're not really solving the problem. Okay, so everything everywhere, that means everyone. So the messages from Mindy and Greg, and particularly in Greg's presentation, about this is about understanding the impacts of climate change on everyone and on climate action with everyone. And what are the conditions that Greg told us about? And some of them were looking at our society in general, but many of them also talked about our community here in DC. We have systemic problems with racial segregation in this city today. I've lived in this city for more than 50 years. The reality of this is absolutely clear and true. Greg referenced one of his maps was from the DC Health Equity Report from, I think, 2019. Please go read that and look at the maps in that report. The maps in that report show racial distribution in this country. It shows poverty, in this city. It shows poverty distribution in the city. It shows education quality distribution in the city. It shows obesity distribution in the city. It shows food desert distribution in the city. Every one of those maps is the same. They are telling us that all of these conditions that we face are systemic They're all part of those interlocking crises. We can't solve climate change without impacting this whole network of interlocking crises. And I think that I would just underscore one of the things that Greg talked about, and that is income and wealth disparity. I can tell you from my travels as AIA president around the world looks at America and goes, "What's with you guys? You don't get that there's common good? You don't understand that having people that are homeless and having people that are impoverished, it hurts everyone." And I think that we're fortunate to be in a city where that is understood, that is recognized, and that actually drives a lot of policy, a lot of the conversation about affordable housing, for example, actually a lot of the development, and I'll come to that in a minute, that we've seen in the last couple of decades particularly. There's a consciousness of the social and economic and environmental inequity themes that Mindy and Greg talked about. So let's switch pages and talk about the facts and the evolution and history that Brian and Sarah showed us. It's quite an amazing story. And for those who are not from Washington, we have a number of people from around the country listening in today. For us here in Washington, the most incredible thing about our reality is we have a city that started as a plan. Most cities didn't. Most cities started as a place where there was a good port, or there was a great place to trade, or whatever. And they kind of grew and grew and grew for decades, sometimes centuries. And then somebody said, "Uh-oh, we have a city. We need to organize things." Washington started out as an organizational concept, which is incredible. And from my perspective as an architect, how much of it is still readable today? It's just amazing. I mean, the maps that Brian and Sarah showed us, and in fact, even the photos of buildings that Sarah showed us, I know those buildings. Washington is living heritage. It's right here. What we need to do to respond to climate change is in the maps and buildings that we saw. Much of that story focused on the pebble in the pond. And the pebble in the pond was the creation of the federal city. And the sort of energy flowed out from that. And to this day, there is still kind of baked into Washington, frankly, the difficulties and inequities that sort of come with that. This is a very focused place. We're a one industry town. We have government, and that industry really determines a lot of what we do. We have some associated industries as well, like education, for example, that sort of come with that. But so that characterizes a lot of our city. The development eras that we saw, this is literally the clay that we potters are going to work with to create climate solutions. I mean, that we saw it defined here in those maps and those images. The Washington building stock, common buildings, the characteristic that those buildings have, the things that Brian and Sarah showed us. One of the things that's most amazing to me about Brian's maps is how much of those things are still here. I mean, yes, there has been redevelopment in Washington. Much of it has been redevelopment of downtown. Many of the residential neighborhoods outside of the L'Enfant plan, outside of the old city, those are the first buildings that were ever built there. And those buildings are still there. So the character of the city that Brian and Sarah showed us, and the character of the buildings that Brian and Sarah showed us, that's it. That's what we've got to work with. What we need to decarbonize, we just saw today. That's it. That's our challenge. Decarbonize that stuff. Okay. I would just point to that, not just in terms of those the physical artifacts of those buildings, but you begin to see what it means in terms of the sort of social economic realities of the city that we're also dealing with. And particularly when you get to the later half of the 20th century and the kind of Robert Moses era urban development that happened. Washington got urban renewed just as much as any other city did. Our fabric got ripped apart and put back together in the name of progress in ways that have defined to us today some of the biggest challenges to face. The Southeast Freeway. What the heck are we going to do with the Southeast Freeway? That is a wound that goes right across our city, that there is no easy solution to that. That's a multi-billion-dollar infrastructure project to be able to deal with that. The Kennedy Center proposals over the years, just trying to deal with the clover leaf that goes around the Kennedy Center, with the new Reach project, they're spending millions of dollars to try to deal with these scars that were created by the urban renewal area. And the social and economic scars that Greg described are just a hugely complex part of it. I've said a number of times today things about the progressiveness of our city, and I want to talk about particularly the 21st century development that we got to see that I think shows some pretty hopeful signs about an awareness in the city in general and literally among city planners. And so I'll point to the wharf, the yards, and NOMA, which we actually heard in Greg's poem, NOMA mentioned as a sort of a sign of gentrification. And that's true, but I'm going to say, but those three developments were planned by the Office of Planning specifically as three areas that could get hugely redeveloped, have thousands of housing units built on them, and dislocate almost no one, because no one lives there. Over the Union Market, we were very much displacing our Whole Foods market, and ask the restaurateurs in town; they're not that happy about it. Their whole, how do they get wholesale foods now is completely changed for the restaurants in Washington. But we haven't dislocated people from their homes to do those developments. There's also another hopeful thing, and I'd point to, St. E's, Columbia Heights, the Capitol Gateway project, the Fort Lincoln project, where the development inequities that really ignored the African-American communities in Washington. The planning offices over the last couple of decades have gone, that's not fair. What can we do to bring, hopeful, intense new development to underserved African-American neighborhoods? And each one of those development proposals is an attempt to do that, is to really address some of the inequities. You can argue with the effectiveness of any of these, and you can argue with whether it aligns with historic preservation principles and practices and priorities as well. But there is an awareness of the sort of world that we're really having to operate in. And so I'll just close by saying I think that this was a great program to bring literally kind of the left brain and the right brain sides of this proposition. And it especially just ending with those historic district maps and the landmark maps. So for us in the building stewardship world, you can't look at that map and say we're not involved. We have to be involved. Look at how much of the city is actually intact, original historic development. That is one of the prime lessons of this mapping exercise that we saw today. It's not an us and them thing. It's us and us, that our concerns of being the stewards of the heritage building stock, we're right in the middle of it. We don't get to elect whether we want to decide to be in the middle of it or not. We're right in the middle of it. The things that we care about are the things that really form a significant armature of what really defines this city. So if our city is going to aggressively take on climate change, We, as the heritage stewards of this city, we're chosen. We have to play a role in this. If we aren't proactive about it, we will suffer the consequences of having to be reactive. And heaven knows we've learned that lesson over the last 50 years. So this program is about getting proactive, learning the left brain and the right brain lessons that we got today, and then now really proceeding with the why and how of being both the stewards of the heritage building stock and, in fact, of all existing buildings in Washington, and then playing a role in climate change. Next program, we are literally going to learn about what is the climate action future of Washington, and then also what is the development future of Washington, and how do we play our stewardship role proactively in both of those futures as defined by both of those futures. So thank you to everyone for participating today. Thank you very much for our presenters. You exceeded my expectations. A really wonderful program. And we will see you again in a few weeks. I think, Rebecca, you wanted to wrap up with a comment or two. And I'll turn it over to Rebecca again.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you to all of our presenters today. It was very informative. The maps and the history of the building stock, and really is a great tool for how we move forward, and understanding a little bit better of how we got here from Greg and Mindy is really important, as well as we discuss equity in our town as well. So with that, we do have two more programs that are scheduled for this fall, one being October 19th, the DC Building Sector Climate Action Plan, where we'll have speakers from the Department of Energy and Environment and also from the Office of Planning, who will be discussing how DC is moving forward with their implementing their plans. In addition, we will have case studies on December 8th, where we'll be talking about optimizing our heritage resources that we have in DC by looking at some case studies on best use practices. And with that, I'd just like to thank you all. Please see more information about the Preservation League and these activities at our website at dcpreservation.org. And have a great day. Thank you so much.